And hello, Peter B. Collins, you brought a very great writer from The Intercept. Trevor Aronson is here. This is exciting. Hello, Peter.
Hi, David. Great to be with you. And I just want to acknowledge that Rabbi Pollack is a great movement leader. I interviewed him a few years back when he was starting the Harrisburg protests, and I'm just glad you had him on the show. I was stuck on another Zoom call, so I will listen to the segment later.
Well, this is exciting. You've got Trevor Aronson here. So why don't you introduce him? This is fantastic. Thank you.
Trevor Aronson is a man that I've known for almost 15 years now. I have great respect for his work as a journalist, and he has helped inform my continuing bias against the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That bias goes back to the 1970s when I covered the trial that was brought by the survivors of Fred Hampton, who was murdered by the Chicago police in a plot that was designed and executed by the FBI. And Trevor wrote a powerful book called The Terror Factory: Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. Trevor, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, Peter, thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me.
And you also have a piece in The Intercept entitled Echoes of FBI Entrapment Haunt Failed Plot to Kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor of Michigan. So I know we'll be talking about that.
Well, and Trevor has been writing at The Intercept, what, 8 or 10 years now?
Something like that. I think I started there in 2014. Yeah, so getting there.
Yeah. And you've done a lot of great work exposing the various sting operations of the FBI, the vast majority of which were aimed at Muslim Americans, the vast majority of which involved a paid FBI informant. Some 15,000 of those informants have been on the payroll of the FBI in recent years since 9/11. The published public budget for these informants exceeds $40 million a year, the last time I looked. So we have a history of the FBI using what I consider to be entrapment in many cases. Sometimes these informants are useful in breaking up an intended terrorist plot. But those are a very small subset of these domestic terrorism investigations that really boil down to framing up individuals who really don't have any ability to defend themselves. So Trevor, before we go to Michigan for the Wolverine Watchmen case, give our listeners who perhaps have not seen your work before an overview of the FBI's role since 9/11.
Sure, yeah. So if you look at the prosecution of international terrorism suspects or defendants since 9/11, and by international terrorism, I mean, how the federal government refers to it. So, someone who, even if they've never left the United States, kind of affiliates or sympathizes with an international terrorist ideology such as ISIS or Al Qaeda or Hamas or any of a number of foreign designated terrorist organizations. What you end up looking at over the last 20 or so years is that the government, the Justice Department, has prosecuted a little more than 900 defendants in international terrorism cases. And of those, just over 450, roughly half of the total, are defendants who were caught up in FBI sting operations. And what that means is that the FBI finds someone who, the FBI claims espoused some danger or, was interested in moving forward in some sort of terrorism plot. And the FBI, through the use of an informant, sometimes the use of an undercover agent, will pose as someone who can facilitate that plot. And so the form it generally takes is that you have someone, perhaps a loudmouth who, has some really bad ideas about getting involved in violence, but on their own lacks the means. They don't have weapons. They don't know anyone who can buy, they can buy weapons from. And even if they did know someone they can buy weapons from, they don't have any money. And so the FBI, in the use of these sting operations, basically solves all of those problems. They provide all of the weapons needed for a plot, oftentimes providing what are, sophisticated bombs, or in some cases, like even surface to air missiles that, even like the mafia would have trouble obtaining. And so, what ends up happening is that you get the FBI through these sting operations takes what can reasonably be described as a pretty hapless person and then transforms them into what seems like a really scary terrorist who was plotting to, bomb a building downtown or use a surface to air missile. And then what happens is the government then parades those arrests out to the public. It makes national news. And, it appears that, the FBI has foiled all of these terrorism plots. And I think, if you look back over the 20 years since 9/11, a big reason that you can kind of point to the Islamophobic hysteria that really kind of engendered in this country, and in which, Donald Trump kind of tapped into as a presidential candidate when he, called for shutting down the borders to, Muslims entering the country. That hysteria was largely created by, these, hundreds and hundreds of sting operations where the FBI manufactured the threat and then portrayed it to the public as real. And so a lot of my work is trying to, pull back that curtain to show that, these sting operations and these terrorism plots that the FBI has portrayed to the public are not all that they appear to be. In many cases, the defendants who are caught are utterly incapable of even, minor crimes, let alone grand acts of terrorism. And in many cases, in some cases, the defendants have been diagnosed with mental illness and have been easily manipulated by FBI informants who themselves stand to make, 6 figures or more in compensation by, bringing these people into, prosecution. And so the informants have a reason to be aggressive. They have a direct incentive to get paid by kind of setting these people up in terrorism plots. And this has really become kind of the bread and butter way that the FBI has found terrorists in kind of the post 9/11 era. And a way to think about it and explain why this is happening. And when I say this, I don't mean to suggest that there isn't a threat of terrorism. Obviously, there's a threat of extremism from, an array of ideologies, some of whom, may be quite violent and potentially terrorist. But that threat is actually pretty small, right? But the FBI is under enormous pressure post 9/11, or was under enormous pressure post 9/11, to find the next terrorist. And so, instead of saying, okay, Congress, you gave us, billions of dollars and we searched all around and we didn't find any of these terrorists, these sting operations allow the FBI a very kind of convenient mechanism to go to Congress and go to the public and say, hey, you've given us billions of dollars in counterterrorism. Let us show you what we did with your money. And then they can create these sting operations. But obviously the real question becomes how many of these people were truly threats. And the answer to that is that not many of them actually were.
And Trevor, if I may put you on the spot, you've covered hundreds of these cases, but 2 stick out in my foggy memory. One is a kid from the Chicago area who wasn't old enough to drive or didn't have a car, I don't recall. But when he told his FBI handler that he wanted to blow up a courthouse, the handler said, well, why don't we start with something small? How about a shopping mall? And the kid said, okay. And then he said, but, I don't have any money. And the FBI informant bought his stereo speakers, or told him that he could trade his stereo speakers for a bomb. Explain that case a little bit, and then I'll just double it up. There was another one of a kid, I believe in Arizona, who was FBI until he became 18. And they gave him a phone, a burner phone, because his mother objected to him getting phone calls from the FBI. And once he achieved the age of 18, they busted him. If you could thumbnail those 2 stories, please.
Yeah, so the first is you mentioned in outside Chicago is a man named Derek Sharif. And Derek was a reasonably new convert to Islam and had really fallen on hard times, and actually was borderline homeless, was looking for a new place to live. And he meets this FBI informant, and the FBI informant says to him, hey, you can live in my apartment. And to Derek, this was kind of a feeling of God at work, kind of verified for him a lot of what he saw in his new religion. And so he goes and lives with this FBI informant. And in conversations that the informant encouraged, Derek had these kind of wild ideas of, killing a judge. He didn't even know the name of the judge. It was just kind of these fantasies of a somewhat deranged mind. And, you know, eventually the informant keeps prodding him and says, you know, maybe we should attack a shopping mall. And Derek seems interested in it. But the problem was that even after the FBI, through the informant, introduces an undercover agent who can sell weapons, specifically some grenades, Derek didn't have any money. And so the FBI had to kind of think on its feet and figure out a way that they could engineer this plot so that, you know, he could get these grenades. And the only thing of value that Derek apparently had were these old stereo speakers. And so the informant tells Derek, he's like, well, my guy, the arms dealer, you know, if you give him these stereo speakers, and I think it'll, you know, he'll exchange them for some grenades. And that's what Derek does. He gives this undercover agent these old stereo speakers, and the undercover agent gives him these grenades that, you know, were inert, but Derek didn't realize that. And he's arrested and charged with a conspiracy to bomb a shopping mall in Illinois. You know, I mean, the absurdity of that case is pretty obvious, right? I mean, I can't imagine any arms dealer accepting stereo speakers in exchange for grenades, but
maybe on eBay, maybe there's somebody. You never know. You know?
Yeah, and
okay,
and then the case in Arizona that you mentioned is an example of where the FBI, you know, there have been a number of cases where the FBI has met an impressionable young man, and in many of these cases, I suspect, had the FBI just gone to the family's home, knocked on the door, and said, "Hey, we're the FBI. We saw your son doing some stupid stuff online, or saying some, you know, he was saying some, you know, really kind of horrible things at the mosque. You know, tell him to knock it off, right?" And I think in most cases, like, the family would have gotten involved. The son would have, like, realized that he was, you know, not doing what he should have been doing, and kind of scared straight, so to speak, right? But as FBI agents have told me, you know, over and over again, when I've mentioned that as a possible solution, they're like, well, you know, what's the FBI? We're not like a social services agency. That's not what we do, right? And so instead, what they do is they kind of push people along into plots until the FBI can do what it's meant to do, which is arrest people and result in, you know, criminal charges. And so the case you're talking about there is someone who was very much on the borderline, was actually a minor when he was first encountered by the FBI, or the FBI first encountered him, I should say, and ultimately kind of pushed him along into a plot that, you know, was questionable at best, but really, you know, probably shouldn't have even gone as far as it did. And I think the reason plots like that go farther than they should is simply the enormous pressure that the FBI is under, in that, you know, as I mentioned before, the FBI, the largest part of its budget is counterterrorism. And so you end up having this tier of pressure where, you know, the upper levels, the executive levels at the FBI are telling people running their local offices that they need to find terrorism cases. That, you know, pressure gets put down on individual agents, who then put that pressure on informants. And so there is just this kind of direct incentive to try to make cases when those cases might not be cases after all.
And Trevor, moving into 2020, presidential election year, critical part of the pandemic period, and also the FBI was under great pressure to deal with domestic white supremacy terrorist groups. And A.C. Thompson did a great job on Frontline and in other outlets reporting on Atomwaffen, this very militant group that there was a guy murdered in Huntington Beach, California, in relation to Atomwaffen. So there was a lot of pressure to deal with these militant white groups. And here comes the Wolverine Watchmen in Michigan. They're all worked up because of Governor Gretchen Whitmer's pandemic responses, lockdowns, masking, school closures. Every state pretty much experienced some variation of that. And this is a case where there were as many FBI informants as there were suspects. And the trial is underway right now. It's being kind of blanked out by coverage of Ukraine. We're not seeing a whole lot of mainstream media coverage. And the Associated Press, which is doing, you know, at least an attempted job at covering the trial on a daily basis, barely acknowledges the exposure of the FBI in this case. They do note that the defense is using an entrapment argument. But I want to credit Ken Bensinger and Jessica Garrison, who first published the backstory of this plot at BuzzFeed, and it was last July. And it set off my bullshit detector big time, Trevor, because the way this was played in the media, with a takedown that occurred in October of 2020, just weeks before the election. It was played by Rachel Maddow and other anchors on television as a slam dunk case that these white extremists, Trump supporters, wanted to kidnap Governor Whitmer, and that they had various schemes to achieve this. So with that, give us your take on what you know so far from your investigations and from what the trial has covered to date.
Yeah, I agree. The BuzzFeed has done some really marvelous reporting on this. And then I think what's made this particular case really interesting is that, unlike in a number of international terrorism cases, the lawyers representing the Wolverine Watchmen, or the alleged Wolverine Watchmen, have been really aggressive in kind of getting documents from the government and questioning, the extent to which informants played a role, which is something that you don't often see, or you don't always see, I should say, in some of these international terrorism cases. But to me, what's interesting about this Sting case is that it really is taking the playbook that the FBI mastered over 20 years and targeting, impressionable young Muslims, and is applying it now to, these, domestic extremists. But a lot of the same issues are at play. Among the issues are, the use of paid informants who have a direct incentive because they're getting money from the government, often a lot of money from the government, to build cases. And then the other being that the people involved, while they did have weapons, which makes them somewhat different from some of the Islamist cases we've seen in the past, these frankly were not the brightest bulbs, right? These were people who were living on the fringes. The main, the so-called ringleader, Adam Fox, was kind of living in an apartment where there was no running water and bathroom. He would use the Mexican restaurant next door.
He was living under a vacuum cleaner shop, right?
Right. He was living on a trap door of his friend's vacuum cleaner shop. And, it was just like, and what, he, had so much trouble kind of remembering details of their plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer that other members of the Wolverine Watchmen would call him Captain Autism. And, in addition, it's since come out, or he has since alleged, that for a lot of the talk that they were involved in about, this plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, for much of that, he claims he was high on marijuana. And so, getting back to the plot itself, I mean, the reason that this plot is so problematic, or appears to be so problematic in the way that a lot of these plots targeting Islamist extremists were, is that it didn't appear, or it does not appear to me, that the plot could have happened were it not for the direct involvement of the FBI informants. There was an FBI informant who went by the name Big Dan, who took on a leadership role in the plot. The group of guys in Michigan ended up traveling to Ohio and Wisconsin for, militant training. And those trips were paid for by the FBI, secretly paid for by the FBI, through the use of informants and agents. And, it was during those trips with the FBI informant and an agent's encouragement that the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer kind of came into view, and was really pushed by the group. And so at every stage in this plot, including at the very end, when they were surveilling Gretchen Whitmer's vacation home in northern Michigan, the FBI informants and agents were there. The government's involvement in the plot was so critical that were the agents and the informants not involved, it couldn't have happened. For example, they came up with this audacious plan where they would bomb the lead car in Gretchen Whitmer's, security detail or motorcade, and then rush in and grab her from the car and kidnap her, while simultaneously detonating explosives on a bridge that would prevent, police from being able to respond and make a rescue. Well, the person who was responsible for the explosives to blow up that bridge, which was again critical to their harebrained scheme, was in fact an FBI undercover agent. So there were the informants and the agents were playing these critical roles throughout, in addition to encouraging them. And so the question that's before the trial now, and the trial started last week and has been delayed possibly till Thursday due to someone involved in the trial being diagnosed with COVID-19, but we expect it to start Thursday or thereabout. The question in this trial is really whether this was all talk, which is what the defense lawyers want, the jury to believe, that this was all talk and this was entrapment, or what the government is alleging is that even though these agents were involved, the informants were involved, that this was a real plot. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, what's interesting about this case compared to Islamist extremism cases is that the record of conviction in Islamist extremism cases from FBI stings is almost perfect. There have just been a couple of people for kind of different reasons that ended up getting acquitted at trial. But the overwhelming majority of the more than 450 defendants who are caught up in FBI stings have been convicted. And many of those people argued entrapment unsuccessfully at trial. And so it'll be interesting to see whether the egregious aspects of this case, result in any sort of acquittal as a result of entrapment, or kind of more interestingly, whether a jury is going to view this differently because it's domestic extremists involving white people versus kind of international extremism involving mostly brown and black people.
And Trevor, you mentioned Big Dan. He originally was contacting the FBI as a sort of whistleblower because he was concerned about some people in the Flint area where he is based, who were, talking about violent action. And Big Dan was flipped to become the kind of lead dog on the FBI informant team. And as I recall, he was paid more than $50,000 for his work in, this is my view, framing these schlubs who were loudmouths. They were the kind of people who showed up in Lansing at the state capitol with an AK-47. But fundamentally, they didn't have their shit together in any meaningful way that they could have pulled this off, as you've said, without the deep support of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Right. So Big Dan was a retired, I believe he was a retired postal worker, and he had formerly been in the military. And as I recall, he had come across the Wolverine Watchmen because they were recruiting people on Facebook to get involved in military training. And to him, this was a way to kind of sharpen his military skills, which had atrophied over time. And then he starts going to the Wolverine Watchmen and realizes that it's more than just kind of like, practicing military techniques. It's, talking about violence against the government. And he goes to the FBI. And you're right, they sign him up as an informant. They pay him more than $50,000. And again, this reminds me of kind of the case you mentioned in Arizona, where, the FBI faces, has information that someone may be involved in, interested in getting involved in some sort of terrorism plot. And so instead of confronting the person and maybe asking questions in a way that would startle them and scare them and maybe stop them in their tracks, the FBI instead uses undercover operatives to push the plot forward, right? And so, a reasonable question, I think, in the Wolverine Watchmen case, and this gets at kind of policy and practice of the FBI, is if, had Big Dan contacted them, as he did, instead of signing up that guy as an informant and asking him to be an operative for the FBI, what if, FBI agents dressed in black suits show up at the Wolverine Watchman house and are like, hey, we heard you guys are interested in plotting, we want to ask you some questions about these plots to get involved in violence. It's possible, and I'm not saying this would have happened, but it's possible that would have scared them enough to be like, oh, wow, we need to back off. The FBI knows what we're doing. And that, obviously hundreds of thousands of dollars that the FBI, if not millions, invested in time and resources in setting up the Wolverine Watchmen may have been unnecessary because, these guys that maybe they're talk, maybe they're not, but once they're kind of, have this, get scared by FBI agents showing up at their door, it's quite possible that they would have stopped. But the FBI practice and policy is not to do that. The FBI practice is to go in and try to push the plot forward. And what I would argue is that the reason they do that is they have this direct incentive to build cases because they're under pressure to create new cases. And that pressure was even greater, starting in 2017, 2018, we began to see a rash of violence that, was, allegedly inspired by Donald Trump and his rhetoric, right? The most famous example of this was the strip club DJ in South Florida who mailed small crude pipe bombs to Democratic Party officials and CNN. His name was Cesar Sayoc, and there became this like growing media narrative that Donald Trump was fermenting violence through his campaign rhetoric, and as a result, there was a lot of public pressure on government to do something about that, and in turn, the FBI was under increasing pressure to be more aggressive with domestic extremism in a way that it hadn't been during its previous 20-year focus on international extremism and Islamist extremism. And so this Wolverine Watchman case is really born out of that suddenly the FBI, under so much pressure to combat domestic extremism, really is able to kind of hang its hat on this particular case and say, hey, we busted this really about as high profile plot as you can get, right? Like, the kidnapping of an American governor. And that also is something that, just, created an enormous amount of media buzz and attention, right? I mean, I noted in my article that, when it was announced, there was actually a hurricane about to strike Texas, and that got knocked off the front, story of the evening news. And it was this plot to kidnap Whitmer. And so what this creates, and what we saw this create in the 20 years after 9/11 with Islamist extremism, is that as the FBI builds cases like this, it gets a lot of attention. The public, throws up its arm and says, oh, we're really concerned about this new threat. That puts more pressure on the government to find these cases. And then we have this kind of like wag the dog effect where, the government is kind of finding more and more of these cases. And one of the things I noted in my article was that you see this kind of questionable numbers being thrown out by Christopher Wray, the FBI's director. I think it was in 2017, he said the FBI had 1,000 open investigations involving domestic terrorism. 18 months or a year later, it was 2,000. And then the most recent number he had was 2,700, which is just an enormous amount of investigations. And it's like so enormous that that's really hard to believe. And I interviewed Michael Sherwin, who was the former Deputy Attorney General for National Security under Trump. And, he had pointed out that this is kind of a numbers play, right? This is how Washington works. You're getting a lot of money to do this. And so you need to be able to, give these large numbers. But what the FBI isn't transparent about is like, what does that number really mean? Like, is it 2,700 like Wolverine Watchman style investigations? Or is it like, somebody called an FBI office and said, my neighbor's a neo-Nazi, and that, initial assessment counts as an inquiry, right? And so, what we're seeing and what I fear is that a lot of the dynamics that played out in exaggerating or inflating the threat of Islamist extremism within the United States in the 2 decades after 9/11 are being duplicated in this new kind of push to investigate right-wing extremism. And I mean, obviously, right-wing extremism is a concern. There have been a number of cases, including deadly ones, but the fear I have is that, these types of cases will end up kind of exaggerating that threat in the same way that we saw the Islamist extremist threat exaggerated in previous decades.
Trevor Aronson, thank you for your reporting. And I'll just add that we will never know if the coverage of the bust of the Wolverine Watchman in October of 2020 had a material impact on how people voted. And, I don't support any of the Trump bullshit that the election was rigged against him. But this media coverage and the operations of the FBI, I think, are, fair to inspect for the impact that they certainly may have had on how people voted. David, did you want to talk to Trevor?
Absolutely. Trevor, you've been very generous with your time. Can you spare a few more minutes?
Sure, yeah, of course.
Professor Marianne Cummings joins us. She was the first one to talk about the kidnapping conspiracy. What is your question, Professor Marianne?
Yeah, and thank you. By the way, Trevor, I have been reading your work for a number of years at The Intercept, and it's been very interesting. So one of the questions I had years ago when you were writing about this is, these investigations do grind up a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money. How is that impacting the FBI's ability to nab real terrorists? And I give the example before of this Major Nidal Malik Hassan, Major Hassan.
Right.
He was the doctor, I think it was at Fort Hood, that went on a rampage. And And it wasn't out of nowhere. I mean, he'd gone to Afghanistan, and I think he'd become radicalized. I believe he was an army psychiatrist. He was an army doctor. And he was coming back, you know, saying all kinds of stuff about what we're doing. And, you know, like, and I thought, what, how is it that nobody picked up on this? And I'm wondering, and I'm also thinking in terms of this latest, you know, case of the Michigan Wolverines. There was a case last year, I believe, where there was a guy committed suicide, but I think he had a truck full of explosives, and it was in Nashville. He didn't kill anybody, but his girlfriend had been trying to call people saying, look, you know, my boyfriend has got some issues here. I'm really scared. So it seems like they're spending a lot of time creating these terrorists, and they might, you know, they seem to not catch these other guys who really are dangerous.
No, it's a great point. I mean, because that is what's happening. You know, what's hard to quantify is like how many, you know, cases maybe didn't happen as a result of FBI intervention and which ones they missed, right? But you can kind of look at it in anecdotes, and certainly there are a number of examples from, you know, the Boston Marathon bombing and others where, you know, the FBI had reason to look into these people and chose not to, or got very, you know, dangerously close, right? Najibullah Zazi, for example, was very, very close to bombing the New York subway, and fortunately the FBI stopped him, but they probably should have stopped him a whole lot sooner. And so, you know, my assessment of this has always been that, you know, catching really dangerous and kind of operational terrorists, as the FBI would use the term, is really hard, because these are people that, you know how to hide their tracks, are generally able to, you know, are smart enough not to go around talking to people who could be informants, basically, right? And so the way that the FBI stings are set up is that they're basically set up to catch the lowest hanging fruit, the people who are kind of dumb enough to, you know, be talking about what they want to do to basic strangers who could be FBI informants, or are maybe not using encryption to communicate, or as in the case of many of these Islamist extremism cases, like people like posting to Facebook about what they want to do, right? And so those are the people that the FBI are largely catching.
Because they don't have to worry about them actually pulling off.
Right. Yeah. So they're able to pull it off only in the sense that the FBI gives them the ability to pull it off. But, you know, so in that way, you know, I think you can, you know, anecdotally make a pretty strong argument that the FBI is kind of catching the people who maybe have bad ideas but don't have the capacity, and in spending so much time and resources on that, are missing truly dangerous threats, including. But
could the low-hanging fruit lead to something bigger?
You know, it could. I mean, that is the FBI's argument, right? When I've asked them about this, FBI agents will say, well, we're catching them, you know, they're what the analogy that they often use is that there's a line from sympathizer to operator, and they want to catch them just before they cross over that line. And so their response to criticism such as mine is to say, like, you don't know what that guy would have done had we just let him go on for a year, right? And of course, that's an impossible thing for me to argue against, because obviously I don't. But at the same time, though, I think it's highly unlikely that many of these cases, based on the evidence of the case and who the person was and who they had contact with and what their capacity was to get weapons, you can, you know, argue that it's unlikely that that would have happened. And so I think, you know,
are there any stories of the FBI accidentally facilitating a disaster?
No, I mean, that's always been the concern, right? So, you know, the concern is like, what happens if the FBI kind of...
They would cover that up. I would assume the FBI would cover that up.
Yeah. I mean, that's never been revealed. So if that is something, that's not something we currently know about. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind too is that in all of the sting operations that the FBI has done, you know, or any terrorism cases, they've never found the guy who, you know, they bust and they're like, we got a tip and he had a garage full of bombs, right? Like, they never find that guy. It's always the guy where the FBI provides the weapons. And so, you know, I think, you know, there is a reasonable question to ask about whether the FBI is spending so much time pursuing, you know, the lowest hanging fruit that likely isn't possible, while missing the harder cases. Because the truth is, like, you know, ever since 9/11, the FBI has been both an intelligence agency and a criminal investigations agency, but it measures its success through the same metrics that any law enforcement agency does, right? Like the number of cases. And so there's an incentive for FBI agents to kind of pursue easy to make cases because that's a number. And so, there is this kind of direct incentive that the FBI has to pursue these easier cases. And, the question that I think we can debate about that can't fully answer, is whether that's coming at the expense of finding these harder to build cases that represent much greater threats to people and safety.
Before you go, I have one quick question that I see Professor Marianne has a question. AppScam. I'd asked Peter B. Collins about AppScam. This was where I believe FBI agents dressed up as fictitious oil sheiks and offered bribes to Congress people. I think it's called a honey trap. And they were indicted because they took bribes, fake bribes. Is that entrapment? Is there anything wrong with sussing out people who haven't taken a bribe, haven't committed an act of terrorism, aren't planning an act of terrorism, but would commit an act of terrorism if enough weapons were presented to them?
I mean, over time, I think both the legal, the court system's willingness to accept these cases as not being entrapment and the public's willingness to accept these as not being entrapment has shifted to not accepting it, right? Like if you look at AppScam early on, there were cries by the ACLU, including members of Congress, saying this is entrapment, this shouldn't have happened. Not long after AppScam, of course, was the sting that targeted John DeLorean, the auto executive, who ultimately was acquitted, arguing entrapment at trial. But then what ends up happening in the 80s is you have this explosion of sting cases involving drugs during the war on drugs. And over time, I think we began to kind of condition Americans and the American justice system to think of these cases as not being entrapment. And the legal doctrine that has kind of arisen around this is this idea of predisposition, that it's not entrapment if the government can prove that you were predisposed to commit this crime. And predisposition is a fairly low bar, right? Like if you're in a conspiracy with an undercover agent to rob a bank, Googling bank robberies or watching bank robbery movies or surveilling your local bank, that's all predisposition, even if it was all done fairly innocently. And so I do think that if you look, I mean, what's interesting to me is for a project not so long ago, I was looking at the media coverage of AppScam, and I was really struck by the outrage that existed. And that's an outrage that doesn't exist in cases like this any longer. I mean, you still have people like me and you and others who are talking about it, but I think we've kind of conditioned ourselves as a society to be okay with this kind of tactic from the US government.
I remember on Hill Street Blues, they always had the cops dressing up. The male cops like to dress up as prostitutes to arrest the Johns. And I think it was more about the dressing up, I think, than actually cleaning up the street. Professor Marianne, and then we have to wrap it up. And
thank you very much. No, I just was wondering too that, in order to really be effective in tracking down possible terrorism or trying to lower the terrorism threat in general, you need to build up some trust within a community. And I'm concerned that you have a case like what's going on in Michigan. Like a lot of people know these guys, and my sister lives near there, so I was reading a lot of local press, and like some of these guys are just considered stand-up guys in their community. Like a lot of people like them, and and then suddenly the FBI comes in and this happens. I think that some kind of resentment might start building up. And I'm sure that, the FBI or our government really wanted to get information from the Muslim community, for instance, 20 years ago. But the way that young Muslim men have been treated by our law enforcement, that would make kind of a disincentive for a community like that to be cooperating with people that are seen as fundamentally hostile. Do you see that?
For sure. I mean, that effect has been dramatic in Muslim communities in the decades after 9/11. Early on, I think there was a great willingness of Muslim communities to try to tell the FBI about people that they were concerned about. That obviously Muslim communities were knew their communities better than anyone else because they lived there. And so when someone came in that they thought represented a danger, they're really the best ones to be able to identify that person. But what ended up happening in the later years is that these Muslim communities began to realize that, if I call the FBI and give them a tip, I'm going to get under kind of FBI scrutiny because they're going to want to recruit me as an informant, or that they're going to kind of, come to my mosque more often with informants. And so it doesn't benefit me in any way to communicate more openly with the US government, with the FBI, for fear that I'm going to be targeted in some way. And so, what ends up happening is that the community, or the people that are most likely able to give you credible information about who is and who is not a threat, that kind of information exchange is completely cut off. And the FBI then starts relying on paid informants who, for the very reason they are paid, are not offering the kind of credible information that community members are. And so what ends up happening is you have, what ends up happening in these FBI stings, right? That, the people who are mentally ill are the ones who are targeted, or they're particularly vulnerable, and they're isolated from the larger Muslim community by the FBI informant, who is concerned that if this guy talks to the local imam, he's going to be talked out of this plot that the FBI wants to do. For Muslim communities, this was particularly, this problem was particularly acute because Muslim communities are very much an immigrant community still in the United States. And so a lot of these people who were affected were here on visas. And so the FBI was able to use immigration as a kind of leverage to recruit people who came with information, engendering further mistrust. With the domestic extremist cases, and there's already, that isn't an issue, but there is already mistrust of the government. And so in some ways, the use of these informants and these stings is just kind of confirming for people in these right-wing groups that the government is out to get them, right? And so I think there is this kind of question of, in cases like this, of like eventual blowback, right? Like, does the FBI's aggressive activities in these communities, end up pushing someone over the line that might not have otherwise been pushed over the line? And I think that's, the kind of larger concern for me in these situations. And also, I think, now, like what you're describing in Michigan, these people who are concerned about someone, may not be willing to bring them to the FBI for fear that, what they want is just some sort of intervention. And they're afraid that the FBI will set up some elaborate sting operation that'll, put this person in jail for 20 or 30 years.
Warren G. in our virtual studio audience asks where the pressure is coming from to create all these cases.
Really, it's about money. So Congress sets the FBI's budget, and Congress allocates two divisions. We don't really get a great breakdown, but they allocate toward organized crime, terrorism, and counterintelligence, and the largest portion of that budget is counterterrorism and counterintelligence, which Congress then sets. And so what ends up happening is that there's like a circular movement where that money goes to the FBI, and then every year, and you can watch these testimonies on C-SPAN, where FBI officials have to talk about how they spent the money and what they face. And so, like any government agency, the FBI is looking to preserve the amount of funding it has and hopefully grow it year after year. And so it's absolutely in the FBI's disinterest to go to Congress and say, like, hey, we didn't find many terrorists, you can cut our funding on that. And so there's this direct incentive to build cases, because that means future funding. And really where the safeguard is supposed to be is congressional officials asking the questions that we're asking in this conversation here, right? And questioning, like, should the FBI really be focusing on that? But the problem is that it's a kind of political minefield for congressional representatives to question whether this is the appropriate policy or take, because when they run for re-election 2 years later, their opponent can say, John Doe, your representative, is weak on terrorism because he's questioning, the FBI spending. And so, what we've seen over 20 years is just a political disinterest or inability to, ask the type of questions we're asking tonight. And as a result, the FBI going before Congress and just talking about the cases it's won, kind of earning more and more funding. And so, it really is kind of that simple. It's just kind of the answer is just money.
Great. Thank you, Trevor. Thank you, Peter. Why don't you ask Trevor the important questions?
How can people get in touch with you and read your work, Trevor? And where can they buy your book?
Sure. So I write for The Intercept, which is theintercept.com. I'm on Twitter at Trevor Aronson, and my book is available at Amazon and most bookstores. It's called The Terror Factor.
Thank you, Trevor. Great to see you.
Thank you so
Thanks for
much.
having me.
Trevor. Thank you so much. Peter B. Collins is a Bay Area Radio Hall of Famer. Go to peterbcollins.com for a treasure trove of interviews like this and radio shows and podcasts. And we thank you. And come back, Trevor. Peter, we'll see you next week, I hope.
You will. Thank you.
So much. Thank you.